Now this may surprise some of you, but Jake Paul vs Nate Diaz isn't really that close at all. Here's exactly why Jake Paul vs Nate Diaz has a clear winner, in my opinion. The first thing we're going to analyze are their physical attributes and stats. Jake Paul is 6'1", whereas Nate Diaz is 6 foot. However, they look very similar in height, so they're practically the same height. Now onto their records. Jake Paul has a record of 6-1 with a total of 7 bouts and losing most recently to Tommy Fury. He beat lots of MMA fighters and lost to one boxer. Nate Diaz's record is 22-13, which is not as impressive, but Nate Diaz has fought some very tough fights, so it's very difficult to really compare them off their records or anything like that. We really need to look at their actual ability. Now looking at Nate Diaz, he is a scrapper. He's very well trained in jiu-jitsu and wins many of his fights by submission. Watching some of his fights, one thing stood out to me a lot when I looked at his fights, and it's that he's not the best when it comes to the boxing aspect. Don't get me wrong, he's fairly fast, even though people think he's not for some reason. He's also got decent head movement, but his defense is something which is quite weak. Now another thing stood out to me, and that he's not very precise technically. Although he can, get the job done or keep people away from him, on the ground, it's almost as if he's doing the bare minimum to keep his opponent away from him. And he's not really relying on his punches to do most of the damage. He wants to get it to the ground, which obviously you can't do in boxing. And it's one of the reasons he's going to have a big disadvantage against Jake Paul. You see, Jake Paul's biggest weapon is his overhand right. He's used this many times to knock out his opponents, and I believe this will be utilized a lot in this fight. Jake Paul will be able to see that Nate Diaz is leaving his hands down, not being so technically sharp, and it gives Jake Paul the perfect opportunity to set up a big right hand shot. All it takes is one of these shots, which I'm very sure will land through the cracks of Nate Diaz's defense. Or while Nate Diaz is throwing a shot, it can just come right over the top, and that's all it takes. Well, why didn't this work on Tommy Fury? Well, Tommy Fury's a whole different story. Tommy Fury was being dominant, and there were very few times where Jake Paul was able to set up this shot perfectly. Tommy Fury was putting Jake Paul on the back foot, which meant that every time he threw one of these overhand right shots, they weren't very effective because he was doing it while he was backing off, and it was almost just thrown out there. Now this leads me into my next thing. Jake Paul is good at being aggressive. Especially after losing to Tommy Fury, Jake Paul will be aggressive and looking to be dominant. He will want to be the one pressing Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz, being a slightly smaller opponent and a bit lighter on the ground, will be quite easily pushed around by Jake Paul in terms of pressure. If Jake Paul's coming forward, Nate Diaz can't stand there and withstand the shots. He will have to back off, and this will let Jake not only gain points on Nate Diaz, but also set up a perfect shot. But Diaz does have some strengths. He's fairly fast, and he can easily get some shots in if he can deal with Jake Paul's pressure. If he can not only withstand Jake Paul's aggressive nature and actually combat it and come forward, he might be able to land some shots on Jake. Will they be significant enough to hurt Jake? I doubt it, because we saw Tommy Fury land some shots on Jake, and to be honest, they didn't do a great deal. So although Nate Diaz may be able to gain some points if he applied pressure, a knockout or a TKO for Nate Diaz becomes very unlikely. If Nate does want a chance of winning, it will be through points, and Nate Diaz will have to keep pushing forward, keep pressuring Jake until he can land loads and loads of shots and somehow gain a TKO victory or win on points if he can sustain this attack throughout all 10 rounds. Now let's be honest, Jake Paul does gas out fairly quickly, and if we see in the 7th, 8th or 9th round Jake Paul slowing down, this could be a great opportunity for Nate Diaz to pick things up. But then there's a very big problem with this. The question is, can Nate Diaz really put the pressure on Jake Paul? As I talked about before, Nate Diaz isn't as big physically as Jake Paul, and this will determine if he's going to be able to put pressure on Jake. As the rounds go on, Jake Paul will get tired, but we can't forget Nate Diaz will get tired. And we've talked about Nate Diaz's poor defense and sometimes lousy shots, let's be honest. And as the rounds go on, Nate Diaz naturally will kick into this almost scrappy MMA fighter, which will mean his technique drops, his hands drop, and his stamina and pace drop. And this could lead to the end of the fight. Jake Paul can land that one overhand right, which could either knock Nate out or put him on the back foot for Jake Paul to keep pushing forward and eventually stop Nate Diaz. The problem really lies with Nate Diaz's inability to cause serious damage to people on their feet. Although he's great in jiu-jitsu and MMA, it's a whole different story when you have to strictly stay on your feet and just use your fists to apply pressure. Nate Diaz doesn't really hit that hard, definitely not as hard as Tommy did, and Tommy couldn't knock Jake down. We've also got to consider Diaz's motives in this fight, which are money. Diaz is not here to win it. He doesn't care about winning, he wants the money. And Jake Paul, although he wants the money, also wants to win and rebuild his name back. Combining all these factors, I see Jake Paul knocking out Nate Diaz, or at least TKOing him. Thank you guys for watching. Tell me who you think wins in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.